Sometimes the biggest stories in history aren't about kings or battles. They're hidden in tiny, forgotten scraps of paper, tucked away in an archive. Today, we're basically historical detectives. We're going on a hunt to piece together the life of one woman, Harriet Head, whose story of grit, scandal, and ultimately survival was almost completely lost to time. Let's see what the records can tell us. So, our whole investigation starts right here, with this little notice in an 1868 government gazette. It's announcing that 25 single women have just arrived on a ship called the Tartar, and they're available for work. Now, this was in the super remote colony of Western Australia, and somewhere in that group was a young woman who had just bet her entire future on a new life in a completely new world. And this is how old she was. 19. Just think about that. At 19 years old, Harriet Head made a 3-month solo voyage from England to literally one of the most isolated places on Earth. What incredible courage that must have taken. I mean, can you imagine leaving the world of industrial England, all smog and factories, for Western Australia in 1868? Perth was barely a town, a tiny little settlement clinging to the edge of a massive, unforgiving continent. This is the world Harriet stepped into, all by herself. Okay, so what happens next? Well, for a single woman on the frontier with not a lot of options, the path forward was pretty clear. If you wanted to survive, let alone have a shot at a decent life, you needed to get married and start a family. Fast. And sure enough, here's the proof. Just 1 year after she arrived, she married a man named George Baker. He was a laborer and about 15 years older than she was. This record shows they were living out in York, a small town in the wheat belt. But this is where the detective work really kicks into gear. I mean, who was this guy Harriet married so quickly? When you start digging into the records, a pretty surprising picture starts to emerge. So it turns out the man she married was almost certainly an ex-convict. We found records for a George Baker, convict number 1462. He was a former soldier who'd been court-martialed for desertion. But here's the smoking gun. His father's name was listed as James Baker, which is a perfect match for the name on the marriage certificate. So Harriet hadn't just married a simple laborer. She'd married a man with a serious past. And for a while, they tried to make a go of it. They had 5 children together and moved around the wheat belt, from Beverly to Williams. We can see them in documents trying to buy land, really trying to put down roots. But life in the Australian bush back then was just unbelievably hard, especially for a working family. And then, around 1880, the paper trail changes completely. The story stops being about building a family, and it turns into a story of absolute crisis. Wow, just imagine opening your local newspaper and seeing this. It's a public shaming. George Baker is telling the entire world that his wife Harriet has run out on him. For a woman in the 1880s, this wasn't just gossip. This was social ruin. And then it got so much worse. The police actually issued a warrant for her arrest. The charge? Deserting her family. So now, at 32 years old, with a baby in her arms, Harriet was officially a fugitive. She was facing down not just public shame, but the full force of a legal system that gave women like her almost zero power. And the personal cost of her decision was just devastating. Her baby daughter, Alice, died only 7 months after she fled, and her other kids, they were eventually sent to an orphanage. Whatever pushed Harriet to leave must have been truly awful, because the consequences were just heartbreaking. But believe it or not, Harriet's story doesn't end there. She just vanishes from one set of official records, only to pop up in another, trying to build a totally new life, basically in hiding. It seems she left with this man, Michael Brady. And you guessed it, just like her first husband, he was also an ex-convict. Another former soldier, court-martialed for insubordination. Harriet, it seems, definitely had a type. Together, they had 3 more children, but you can see their desperation written all over the birth records. Look at the names Harriet is using for herself. Vander Solich? Vander Sahik? I mean, where do you even come up with those? These are clearly aliases, a frantic attempt to hide from the authorities, and from a society that would have completely condemned them. But unfortunately, this new life wasn't any more stable than the last one. Michael Brady was a chronic alcoholic with a rap sheet as long as your arm. This newspaper clipping from 1897 reports on his 52nd conviction. The headline just calls him a brute. For Harriet, it must have felt like she just run straight into another dead end.
But then, after decades of poverty and struggle, Harriet's story takes this one last unbelievable turn. With Brady now in prison, she starts this journey towards something she has never, ever had in her life: stability and independence.
You can actually watch her slow climb on this timeline. In 1903, at the age of 55, she marries for a third time. And when this new husband dies, he leaves everything he owns to her. That's the game changer. By 1915, the transformation is complete. The teenage immigrant, the convict's wife, the fugitive, is now a property owner in her own right.
And get this third marriage was really unusual for the time. Her husband, William O'Burns, was 14 years younger than she was, completely flipping the script on the usual age gap. This relationship really signaled a huge shift in Harriet's life and her fortunes.
And this right here, this is the proof. This single line in a city rate book: Burns, Harriet E., listed as the owner of property. After a lifetime of uncertainty and running, she finally had a piece of the world to call her own, a level of security that must have once seemed absolutely impossible. So after a life defined by constant change and reinvention, how does Harriet's incredible story finally come to an end? Well, Harriet died in 1935. She lived to the ripe old age of 87, but look closely at her death notice. It lists her as the beloved mother of her 3 children with Michael Brady. There is not a single word about the 5 children from her first marriage. It's this final poignant clue that suggests that entire chapter of her life and her first family was lost to her forever.
This is 25 Pakenham Street as it looks today. The house stands on the land that she once owned. It's a real, tangible piece of the stability that she fought so hard for so long to finally achieve for herself.
From a teenage girl crossing an ocean to a frontier wife, a fugitive on the run, and finally a woman of property, Harriet's life was just an absolute masterclass in resilience. Her entire story, pieced together from these dusty old files, really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other incredible lives like hers are just sitting there in the archives, waiting for someone to find them?